Welcome everyone to our webinar. Thank you for joining us in all of the different places where you are living. I'm pleased to be here tonight with Dr. Celia Deane-Drummond, who's the Director and a Senior Research Fellow in Theology of Laudato Si Research Institute at Campion Hall of Oxford University. We are excited to engage with one of the leading voices and thinkers in Catholic ecological ethics. And so welcome, Dr. Drummond, Deane-Drummond.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be part of this series, and it's an honor to be invited to have this conversation with you.
Great. So maybe we could just start off and you could tell us, how did you become personally interested in ecological care?
Well, I started life as a natural scientist, a plant physiologist, and I did natural science at Cambridge University. That's an undergraduate degree. And while I was doing that, one of the things I noticed was in our physiology class, they used live animals, so live rabbits. And I remember having some very heated discussions with my tutor about the ethics of doing this, although I didn't have any ethical tools to argue my case. And eventually, of course, they stopped doing this kind of method with students. But I think that was the beginning of one of the reasons, at least, I ended up doing botany and plant physiology rather than going into other opportunities like pharmacology, for example, that also used animals in their research. So right from an early time, I think I wanted the kind of science I did to have relevance to the real world. And so the doctorate I ended up doing was in agricultural botany. But then, of course, came across another ethical issue in that the kind of work I was doing on nitrogen nutrition seemed to me to be not necessarily advantageous to the global community, because it was about encouraging use of nitrates and ammonium fertilizers and so on, or at least looking at the physiology of that. And again, or potentially working with tobacco plants, and all of these created sort of ethical conflicts in me. So around that kind of time, ecological issues were coming to the fore as well. So I moved into theological studies, and again, I found myself interested in doing research. And so it was an obvious thing for me next to work at that intersection of ecology and theology. Around that kind of time, at Manchester University, where I was then, I encountered Martin Palmer, who was working for the International Consultancy of Religion, Education and Culture, working across a wide range of different religious traditions, including the Jewish faith and other traditions. And I needed a way or a means to support my final year of doctoral studies. So I wrote a book, a handbook in theology and ecology, sponsored by the Worldwide Fund for Nature. And so that was my first engagement, really, a serious engagement, but it also was relevant to the doctorate I was writing at the time. But that was a sort of popular outreach kind of book. And so the royalties, still go to the World WWF. So I've always tried to both do academic work, but work that has some ecological relevance in other work. So working at different levels, at the academic and the popular and the public, in order to feel that, unlike the science that I did, there was going to be some relevance in terms of thinking about change. And over time, I've interlaced between doing ethical work in my research and then doing more fundamental or systematic or philosophical work. So I sort of feel those two go hand in hand. And that's sort of in a nutshell, really, how I ended up in this area. So right from an early age, I was fascinated by the nature of the natural world, but then I got drawn in through my own Christian faith to thinking about some of these other philosophical and ethical and global topics. I should just maybe add one more very brief thing, and that's while I was a researcher at Durham University, there was a new movement then towards genetically modified crops. And again, that created an ethical conflict in me, and I started arguing with my other colleagues, and they found it very fanciful and thought that I wasn't an appropriate thing for scientists to discuss. That was back in the 80s. But of course, in the end, those practices were not adopted by the public in the UK, at least, because for ethical reasons. So I think that at that point I decided that science wasn't for me, and so that's when I switched into theology. So in a roundabout kind of way, it all converged really into this ecological but other areas of science too. So as well as being an eco-theologian, I'm also interested in the intersection with theology and science and our own human evolution. So those sort of different strands come together in different projects at different times. But it's been, a fascinating journey, and I'm always learning and enlarging my understanding in different ways.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Well, thank you for sharing with us a little bit about how you became interested in ecological care. So you recently published a book titled Theological Ethics Through a Multi-Species Lens, Evolution of Wisdom, Volume 1. And in the book, you discuss about making the case for thinking about our humanity differently as seen through an interspecies and ideally a multi-species lens. Can you please share a little bit more about what you mean by seeing through an interspecies or multi-species lens?
Yes. While I was at the University of Notre Dame, where I worked from 2011 till, well, my position there finished in 2019, so relatively recently, I encountered some evolutionary anthropologists, somebody called Agustin Fuentes in particular, who was very interested in human evolution and thinking about evolution in a different kind of way from the standard Darwinian model, and more about niche construction theory. And niche construction theory, as you might be able to guess, is also about our ecology. So a much more nuanced understanding of evolution that takes into account the dynamic relationship between humans and other beings. And so I suppose, having worked, with Agustin Fuentes on a number of different projects, including an Evolution of Wisdom project, I became convinced that our own humanity has been crafted and honed, as it were, in a particular niche, and that niche we weren't alone. So our own sort of philosophical and theological understanding, certainly in Catholic Christianity, that sends to stress human superiority, is fundamentally mistaken in many respects, that we need to have a much more expansive notion of who we are in a community of creatures. And so that's, it was the theological and the scientific converging that made me then argue for, again, a different approach to theological ethics. It shouldn't just be about how we act as humans and in thinking about our different virtues, for example, in particular, but also where we are situated in a cosmic or multi-species community. And I want to add one more thing as well. As often virtue ethics has been criticized for being very individualistic. Each virtue is a virtue of an individual, whereas in this particular book, I was trying to argue that actually there are community virtues as well. There are our relationship with the land, with one another, with the natural world, with other beings, is all part of our community sense of where we should go. And that too should be thought of in virtue terms. And some of the specific aspects I discussed in this particular volume have to do with wisdom, compassion, and justice. And all of those, I argue, have their preliminary hints, if you like, in other social animals. So we cannot then argue that we are these special human beings that are able to rise above the vice of other animals and show our own particular virtues. That's a mistaken understanding of who we are as human in our humanity. Rather, those other social beings show us or plant the way, as it were, which we then develop in our own particular way as humans. So we all have a particular gift or charism, and our particular one is different from many other beings, but at the same time, it doesn't, even our morality doesn't necessarily mark out our distinctiveness in a way that makes us completely separate from other beings. Rather, it's both emergent, it is distinctive. I'm not arguing that humans are basically exactly the same as all other beings, of course not. That would be wrong even as a biologist. But what I am saying is that even our greatest assets, our particular dispositions for good, have been crafted in our relationships, and therefore in our own ethical decision making, we need to take into account our history and our story with other beings, as well as our story with other humans.
Fascinating. It's really an important perspective that you're bringing and that you've written on. So you hold 2 doctorates, one in plant physiology and one in systematic theology. There are very few people in the world with doctorates in these 2 fields, or in environmental science and religion generally. And some clergy who have studied in religious seminaries are skeptical of science, especially environmental science. And I would imagine that the perspective that you just shared is not necessarily the mainstream view that I suspect is taught in many seminaries. So what do you think can be done to engage with such clergy on care for our common home?
Yes, I think this is a really important question, and that's one of the reasons I wrote this book, and also another book prior to this one, a monograph called The Wisdom of the Liminal, Evolution and Other Animals in Human Becoming. I'm trying to make the argument that actually our particular way of being human is so interlaced with other beings that it would be a mistake not to think about ecological and environmental questions. So that's just theologically or metaphysically sensible to do that. Of course, there are other scientific arguments as well, but if the skepticism about the validity of science, usually it's about the validity of science to make particular moral decisions. So that's why I focused in on our moral life rather than necessarily some other aspects, because the whole issue of sustainability and climate change is immensely complicated. And I've thought several times about writing another more explicit environmental ethic, as I did in 2004, which is a book called The Ethics of Nature. But the more I go on, the more difficult it seems to me to do that well. So rather than doing the whole spectrum, I think just focusing on our humanity and understanding that may be a first step. In addition, another aspect which I think is extremely important that comes up in Catholic social thought in particular, which is something I think everyone would agree with, whether they are persuaded by the science or not, and that is the poorest of the poor are also impacted the most by climate change and environmental degradation. And of course, if they don't believe that, all they need to do is listen to their stories. So if they're not convinced by the science, then there are witnesses that actually speak of those changes through indigenous communities in the Amazon or other communities all over the world in Africa and so on, that actually show forth evidence, as it were, that these changes are happening and we need to take them seriously. And therefore, we can't really afford just to ignore the science. I mean, science is always the best guesstimate of what's happening at any given time, and it is subject to modification and change. It doesn't look back historically in the way that theology and philosophy does. But at the same time, I think that theology and philosophy has a duty to listen to other disciplines. It doesn't have to agree with everything, but it has a duty, as it were, to be aware of the main conclusions arising out of those sciences and natural sciences and social sciences, and then come to their own measured conclusion about how far this is important. But the specific aspects which I think are undeniable are issues of justice, and also issues around the fact that those who are living in the global south in particular, and in the poorest communities of the world, are the ones that are most impacted by climate change. And if you ask them whether climate change is real or some of these other degradations are real, there won't be any hesitation whatsoever. I think we're sort of living in a bubble in the Northern Hemisphere, where perhaps we're not necessarily conscious of some of these changes taking place. But even in my own lifetime living in the UK, I can see how weather patterns and climate changes has happened remarkably quickly, and the biodiversity again collapsing. So the diversity of species, and even insect species, but other bird species as well, is significantly diminished compared to when I was a teenager. So I can just see it with my own eyes, and I would like to question those who challenge that and say, what is your evidence? Is it evidence from experience? And if so, what evidence are you bringing to bear to the case against listening to what the scientists have to say? And I think the conference on biodiversity this year as well as the COP26 is important. We have to look at not just one aspect of the science, but all these different areas as well. So I hope that's just a rough indication. You did mention, well, how can we encourage seminarians and priests to take this more seriously? I think it's one of the reasons why I'm interested in eco-theology is that if you can show that the fundamentals of the faith, something as simple as God cares for the earth and its creatures, that I imagine that most people wouldn't deny that. So if you can show that, then obviously it's of importance to God to consider, what we're doing with other beings and other creatures, as well as ourselves. So it's even going back to the Genesis text, the Sabbath of creation, the celebration of all of creation at the end of the seventh day, I think, and the wisdom text as well that celebrate creation in the Psalms, Psalm 104 and others. Those are, I think, celebratory Psalms. The book of Job again is a celebratory account of creation, and all these are about the value and the worth and the intrinsic value of creation, as well as, of course, the value of humans. But we're part of that story, and I think the idea that we're interlaced in relationships with the natural world has been certainly part of the Hebrew Bible, and it's probably more prominent in the Hebrew Bible, I would say, than in the testaments that Christians use. So I think that, but it's still presupposed. So I think we need to go back to those sources as well and point those out. Biblical text, other ancient sources such as the patristic writers in the early church, if we're doing that, Irenaeus and Basil of Caesarea and Bonaventure and St. Francis and all those ancient writers that valued creation and creatures in particular and gave them specific specific value, not just in themselves and not just in terms of their usefulness for human beings.
Okay, that's definitely helpful, and I hear you that the ancient sages and teachers are really invaluable in terms of guiding our path for a faith-based sustainable ethic today. So you're now the director of the Laudato Si Research Institute at Campion Hall at the University of Oxford. And in addition, I'm aware that the Anglican Diocese of Oxford has exhibited significant environmental leadership under the guidance of Bishop Olivia. What makes Oxford a world center for Christian environmental ethics and action? How did this happen that both your Laudato Si Research Institute and the Anglican Diocese of Oxford are way ahead of the curve in terms of their environmental leadership and bridging Christian ethics and ecology?
Yes, I mean, that's a very good question. And I mean, maybe I put it down to divine providence, because this is an initiative of the Jesuits in Britain rather than anything specific for Oxford. But it's also something that University of Oxford were wanting to do, was to enhance their concern around issues of sustainability. So they have a carbon neutral project as well. So I think the bishop Stephen involved in the Anglican diocese, soon after I arrived in Oxford, I went into a consultation with him and a few others. So I think it's, given the different Christian denominations, this is an ecumenical venture within and between those. And in our institute, we've employed someone called Tim Howells, who's an Anglican priest by training, and he has already had a very close relationships with that. So I would say those two we are joining up with others as well, because the issues are too large for any single organization to tackle well. And as well as that, I'd say that although you very kindly mentioned this as a hub, we're trying to connect and generate a global Laudato Si research network, networking Laudato Si initiatives in research all over the world. And so, because we recognize that we're a relatively small organization and we cannot implement or do the kind of research and make changes which are in any way sufficient. So although it looks like an important initiative in many respects, we recognize our own limitations as well. And therefore, we have to collaborate and cooperate with others, such as yourselves, who are also working in this stream, because the issues are very urgent and there is so much more to do. So I think the initiative, as I said, was started by the Jesuits in Britain. The principal for the provincial, rather, who came to be the provincial just at the time or soon after Laudato Si was published in 2015, and I had a number of conversations with him in 2017, just before he started, and we started talking about where we would house a Laudato Si research center of some kind, and Campion Hall was the obvious choice because the Jesuits had been in Oxford for over 100 years. So it's a Jesuit sponsored hall, and our institute is independent of the university in some respects, but also because we're part of the hall, we are embedded in the university. So the University of Oxford is complicated because it has halls and colleges as well as university departments. So we work closely with different university departments, but we also have a measure of independence. And I think that's why, or one reason why, we were able to start this initiative relatively straightforwardly, as long as we had the funding to do so. And once we were here, or once we are here, we find that there are very many willing collaborators within the university department. So we're kind of trying to make the most of the fact that, you know, as a world-leading university in Oxford, we have access to a number of different academics and researchers that we might not otherwise have. And so that sort of intersection between academic research and practice and social transformation is something that we are, if you like, trying to emblemize in our Laudato Si Research Institute. So we're concerned with things which are not just pure research, but also how they then translate into action. And so our projects are designed in a way that takes that into account, as well as taking into account the needs of the most marginalized people in the world. So giving them a voice and listening to different epistemologies and frameworks of knowledge, so that we are working with and alongside and in solidarity, or even what I prefer to call accompaniment with others in the global South.
That's great to hear, and I appreciate that, as you mentioned, the Laudato Si Research Institute is also engaged in practice and social transformation and translating the research into action. I'm aware that in the 5.5 years since Pope Francis published Laudato Si, there's definitely been a lot of traction and action by different Catholic parishes globally. And at the same time, I'm aware that global carbon emissions continue to rise, global plastic use increases, global meat consumption increases, global car use increases, with the exception of the pandemic, airplane travel increases. What actions do you think, in terms of practice and social transformation, what are the steps that need to happen to help bring Laudato Si, really front and center in the hearts and minds of Catholics and Christians and all people?
Yes, I mean, I think it's step by step. So, for example, one of the projects we're developing at the moment is in alignment with the Diocese of Salford, that has a bishop there, Bishop John, who is very committed to eco-social transformation. And we are developing a carbon footprint tool that will be used across the whole diocese. So monitoring or recognizing what the carbon footprint is, and then trying to encourage, individual parishes, schools, communities to take steps towards change, I think is really important. So that's just one tiny aspect that we're trying to do, but then it could be multiplied to the Jesuit education establishments across the UK, and then potentially across the other parts of the world as well through our networks. We're also collaborating with JESC, which is the Jesuit social center in Brussels, that is developing some of these tools for use in small institutions. So I think, again, collaboration is the key. And I think that, we see the integral ecology, which is one of the aspects of Laudato Si, which often gets a lot of press. We see that as a paradigm or a framework within which to think how to do things differently. And of course, many of these things were happening prior to Laudato Si coming out. So although that was a watershed in terms of the institution of the Catholic Church, CAFOD, which is the Catholic Fund for Overseas Development, had developed, in association, I should add, with the Theology Reference Group, which I was part of, something called the Live Simply program, which was Live Simply in solidarity and sustainably. And often people didn't quite understand what the sustainability piece meant. So I went on secondment for a full year working with CAFOD and different parishes and so on to try and explain what that meant in practice. So I think it's, if you like, Laudato, it's one thing to get Laudato Si discussed. It's another thing to then say, well, what does that then mean practically for parishes and how people are going to live and change their ways? And it may be that in partnership with other initiatives like the CAFOD Live Simply initiative, that this is going to become alive more. And I have to say that since Laudato Si came out, there's been much greater interest in the Live Simply program than there was before. It's kind of scaled up the level of activity around these kind of areas, although, as I said, it was there before. So I think the Laudato Si has taken off in parishes in a way which it makes it more likely that there will be greater ecological responsibility, even though, as you point out quite accurately, it's not sufficient. So what we really need is a scaling up and a wider global movement to make these changes, so that they're not. It's if you like, a response which is a realistic one in terms of beginning to turn the needle in a different direction.
Great, thank you for sharing that. So I want to go back for a minute to the something we spoke about earlier in regards to multi-species lens. I understand in your book that you offer an alternative to the standard animal rights position on the ethical treatment of animals. Can you share with us a little bit about what this alternative perspective is that you offer?
Yes, I mean, again, it's a slightly theoretical question in that animal rights, practically speaking, may get you to the same place as a multi-species in some respects. But what I'm trying to argue for, or persuade, if you like, are those who are maybe suspicious of animal rights perspectives. But this one, I think, is, more persuadable, because the thing about animal rights is that it's an extension of human rights into the animal field. And some people may be suspicious of that, whereas a multi-species approach is saying, no, we don't need to just use the tools that we have in the human sphere and translate them into the animal sphere. What we need to do is just think of our own human lives differently, so that we are embedded and part of a multi-species community, and on the basis of that system, that different understanding of the system that we're in, or the community that we're in, we begin then to act differently. So it's a different kind of approach. It may result in similar actions, but it's more, I would say that the approach I'm using is more ecological as well, because it's about a community of beings. I've focused in the book specifically on animals, but there's also an opening up to other species and other ecologies as well. So whereas animal rights tends to pitch itself often against ecological understanding, at least in some of the more strident activists that have been involved in the field, like Andrew Lindsay, for example. He very much pitches his animal rights and animal theology in opposition to ecological understanding, whereas the multi-species approach, which I'm pressing for, doesn't do that. It's actually saying, yes, we because we are sort of psychologically in many respects closer to social animals and other animals, it's easier for us to understand that we need to be more responsible and also see ourselves as maybe in a closer relationship with them, but also we shouldn't miss out on the importance of the dynamics of ecology in which all beings are situated as part of our common home. So I think it's a different slant, it's a different approach. What I don't do is look at our microbiome or in this particular book, I don't take the ecological implications as far as some people might like. Often when this book is discussed in academic panels, I get people saying, well, why haven't you done this in a much more expansive way? I would say, well, please go ahead and do that. What I was trying to do in the book was actually focus in on specific moral aspects of our human nature. So our wisdom, compassion, and justice. And so therefore to think about plants, for example, as having elements of justice wouldn't really make much sense. So I had to narrow down the beings with which I engage, but that doesn't mean that it cannot then be scaled up into these other areas as well. So I think that's, in a nutshell, how it's different from animal rights. What that then means in terms of how we act and the choices we make may be analogous in some ways, but my hope is that a wider range of people will be drawn to that compared to animal rights, which often is thought of with suspicion by traditional theologians or those working in ethics. And also, as I said, there's this split between ecological ethics and animal ethics, which I'm trying to avoid.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. So in that regard, your book has a chapter on domestication, including animals and building virtue. And as you're aware, there's a long arc of domestication, and only in the past century or maybe 150 years, it's interesting that you were in South Bend, Indiana for 8 years, because before the 1870s, city people bought locally produced food, and the beginning of meat as a large-scale industry actually began in Illinois and Indiana, with the rail lines that transported livestock from the West to slaughterhouses in Chicago. And I want to, and today there's about 80 billion animals under human control for producing meat, dairy, eggs, and seafood. How do we restore a virtuous relationship between people and animals, especially in regards to the consumption of animal products?
Yes, I mean, this is a huge topic, and if Indiana was a hub of these kinds of activities, shame on them. So, but I think as well, you might be interested that there is a market now, an open market, a farmers market in South Bend, Indiana, which really promotes alternatives, and it's becoming increasingly popular in the US. And I would say almost obligatory now to buy local, to buy factory farm foods and so on. So even though it was, the source of this initiative at the beginning, I think there was ignorance about seeing the worth of other creatures. And so I think that, we need to recognize what some theologians and philosophers call the intrinsic value, or the value in and of itself of each of these creatures. So I think the bottom line for any ethical treatment of other animals has to be refraining from consumption of any meat that's produced in these appalling conditions, not just for the sake of the animals, but also for the sake of the often marginalized groups that are illegal immigrants and others who are employed in these dreadful conditions. And I still remember a conversation I had with my colleague Augustin Fuentes, who I mentioned earlier, who said that he went in there to do an anthropological study, and basically he was almost ill with actually witnessing what happened in some of those factories. So it's not just awful for the animals, it's awful for the people who work there as well. And we've seen how COVID spreads in many of these factory units as well, because there isn't sufficient care for those who are, working in those conditions. But I mean, your other question was really more about domestication, so I want to get back to that. I think, again, in the book itself, I look at the long history of domestication. I'm interested in how it came about, and one of the things that I found really fascinating was that dogs, for example, there are different theories about how it was that even up to 35,000 years ago, dogs became associated with humans through the wolf community. So many think that perhaps it was scraps of food that were left lying around, that and then gradually there was an alliance or association. Others think that maybe wolf pups were taken up by some of the children who were drawn to having a little puppy, and then gradually they became part of the community, or some combination of these things. And others think that it was part of the hunting. So even though they were very small early hominin communities, they did hunt animals and had they did eat some meat in those contexts, but it was very selective what they had, and it wasn't nothing like the kind of consumption that we have today. So in other words, there was a collaboration with domesticates. And in addition to that, there were horses as well in other communities in Africa and things. There've been some studies of that, where horses are free to associate or not associate, and they become bonded with their owners through free association. So there's no fencing or anything like that. They choose to become domesticated, and that's something that really surprised me, that there's this affiliation that's mutual in some ways, a mutual choice of one and the other to become affiliated, because they were protected from predators by being brought into the stables and things, away from sort of common enemies of hyenas or lions and other things like that. So gradually these things sort of evolved and emerged in the human community through this mutuality. And I think we've lost something of that through our mass farming, and the kind of domestication that we have now is not the kind of domestication that it was in the origin of our human species. So I think sort of knowing a little bit about that history, or of course we can't turn back the clock, but at least it makes us think, how is it that we began to have these affiliations and associations, and what then might that tell us about who we are and how we are to relate to other creatures.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. So I read Laudato Si and very much appreciate it, and the breadth and the scope and the very deep teachings on Catholic social ethics and integral ecology. One thing I didn't see in there is mention of moving toward a plant-based diet, or even a vegetarian diet. How do you, in terms of your research as well as promoting practice and social transformation relating to Laudato Si, how do you relate to that, and why do you think that such a call wasn't included in Laudato Si?
Yes, I mean, I think this is again a very interesting and difficult question. I think part of it was because the Pope Francis wanted this document to be widely read, so some of that was avoided. It's also worth pointing out that he came from Argentina, which is a very strong meat-eating culture, and also a macho culture as well. So there was a weakness in his encyclical related to the importance of including women. It wasn't really done sufficiently well, I don't think. So I recognize that there was a flaw in that he could have done more in that respect. And I think there was some disjunction then between this call for interconnectedness that's in Laudato Si and the value of the intrinsic value of all beings and all creatures, and what he said practically about what that then should look like in terms of our own habits of eating and so on. But I think that I think one of the reasons is that he didn't want that part of, or that aspect of our human ecology, as it were, to somehow cloud out the other aspects to do with climate change and issues of justice and human solidarity. So I think that those were the messages that he was trying to get through primarily. I would say that his next encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, talks a lot about solidarity. I would like to include other beings in that solidarity as well. So he could have taken another step there as well, and he hasn't. So he's sort of been a little bit too hesitant, but as a theologian, I'm free to go beyond what Pope Francis has said, and we are also, of course, as an institute, collaborating with other initiatives around the world, including the different Jesuit universities that have got sustainability offices and so on, and the dicastery for integral human development. We're working with them, so we are trying to generate a global approach to these issues, and not just keep it in one box. The work that you're talking about today is just my own personal research, but as an institute, we're doing far more than that. So much of my time is not writing my own research, is actually, even if I might like to do that, much of it is actually building the structure for a new institute that will look at these other bigger questions. Although, as I said, I do have Volume 2 coming out in March this year, which will be on, it's called Shadow Sophia, and it's on sin and the roots of that. So it's I finished it just before the COVID pandemic came out, but I think it's quite relevant to what's happened in that pandemic and how it came to pass. I know the pandemic isn't on our agenda today, but you haven't asked about the Evolution of Wisdom title and how that threads through the different 3 volumes, but just thought I'd throw that in as well, just to give an indication of where I think Pope Francis could have addressed more. So in the area of that area of ecological sin or whatever, could have been addressed a little bit further, I think, and wasn't. And as theologians, I'm trying to not fill in the gaps, but to develop things in a direction which I think is in keeping and in resonance with some of the ideas in Laudato Si without necessarily imitating it completely.
Okay, I'm excited to hear about the work you're doing with Jesuit institutions that have sustainability initiatives. That seems very positive and optimistic. Can you share with us a little bit more about some highlights of those Jesuit-led initiatives?
Yes, I mean there's an Eco-Jesuit group, which is a network of Jesuit initiatives all over the world, and we're plugged into that. We have an advisory group with Eco-Jesuits represented in that advisory board. We're also working with the churches in the global south through an ecclesial network alliance that we're building up as well, some of whom are Jesuits. There is a Jesuit network organization. Michael Garazzini, for example, we're in close correspondence and contact with him, who's the president of the Jesuit universities and colleges worldwide. So we're already working quite closely with him. So, and Nancy Tuckman, of course, and others, they're all on our radar. So we believe that as a Jesuit institute within a Jesuit hall of residence, we have an obligation to at least draw on those Jesuit initiatives. I should also say that the Father General issued the 4 apostolic preferences a year or so ago, and one of those was care for our common home. So there's an initiative in 2022 on the Jesuit initiative on a Congress, on Loyola Congress, which is celebrating anniversary of Loyola, Ignatius of Loyola, in Loyola, and part of that will be emphasizing care for our common home as woven into the other apostolic preferences, which have to do with the young and giving preference for those, and also refugees and so on. So we're also part of that process, which will then influence all the different Jesuit works all over the world. So we're quite excited to be included in all that, in that organization. I'm on a committee with Jesk, which is coordinating this effort. So the short answer is yes, but there's still obviously far more to be done. And we are, we've only existed since 2019, just over a year. So, we're working flat out, but, and obviously COVID has changed things quite significantly for us. But in a way, we've been working in a COVID world just as long as we have in the non-COVID world. So, we are, as I said, going as fast as we possibly can, but also as carefully as we can to build the pieces and put things in place to enable these things to happen.
Thank you for sharing about that. So in your book, you write that, quote, wisdom has many different levels and in the broadest sense is connected with the flow of life understood in its interconnectedness and sociality, end quote. I want to ask you, how can humanity move toward a greater sense of interconnectedness, or what the Buddhist spiritual leader Thich Nhat Hanh calls interbeing? It seems like one of the roots of the ecological crisis is that we're not sufficiently connected to other species, and we're very much, in a anthropocentric mentality that it's all about people. That's the only thing that matters. How do we cultivate a mindfulness and a concern for all of God's creatures?
Yes, another, really important question. And, I think that there has to be a certain openness in people to begin to think slightly differently. So I think that where there is openness, then there are opportunities that will arise. And certainly when I'm teaching this area, one of the things I stress is the need for spending time with the natural world. Even if you're living in a city, there is an opportunity to observe trees or other aspects of wildlife that are still present. And I was shocked when I taught a course in theology and ecology at Notre Dame to find out that many young people in particular had never had time away from their cell phone, just in quiet contemplation with the natural world. So I think that, and when we did that, there was an amazing shift and change in their thinking, just observing and looking at ecological markers as part of that observation. In fact, some of the students became so attached to their tree that, if anything was done to it, which they thought was inappropriate, they became quite emotionally involved and upset. So it made me realize how important it is to encourage that contact. And I know that in the COVID-19 lockdown situations that we find ourselves in, many people near where I live go to somewhere called Port Meadow, which is a sort of wildlife reserve, very adjoining the city of Oxford, and is a floodplain for the Thames, so that it doesn't flood Oxford itself. And literally it's packed with people now, whereas I used to go out there all the time, even before lockdown or even before COVID. And so that's completely changed because people don't have access to gyms anymore. They need to get out and walk and run and so on. But now at least they're being exposed to the beauty and the wonder of the wildlife that's there. Admittedly, of course, like everywhere else, it's diminishing in its diversity, but at least that's the first step. And I think that without that step, without that openness to being in contact with the natural world, it's very hard to, I think there needs to be an emotive and effective change as well as an intellectual change. You can persuade with all the tools you have intellectually, but without that heartfelt love or desire for recognizing the natural world as a good, it's very difficult to begin to persuade people otherwise.
Amazing. I definitely resonate with what you're saying. And when I visited the University of Notre Dame about a year and a half ago, I took some nice walks in the forest areas on campus. There's a question from one of the attendees. A lot of young people have fallen away from mainstream churches because they see a disconnect between what is said and what is done. And the person who wrote this said a lot of these young folks are becoming involved in natural areas restoration what has been the impact to Port Meadow from all the additional human activity?
Again, this is a really interesting question, I think. And one of the shocks to me was the number of people that were having parties there and things because they couldn't meet inside people's homes. So, and at one stage, one of the animals, one of the cows that has grazed there because it's a free grazing area, died. And a shocking picture was then displayed in a poster showing what happened when people didn't clean up their rubbish. So that has changed, though, significantly. There's been a big campaign on not doing that, and so people are being sort of now fined if they do it. So basically what's happened is that, yes, there's been some deterioration initially, but then new rules and regulations have been put in place and fines. So there's greater degree of policing. I wish it didn't have to be like that, but I think people have, gradually become a bit more responsible now compared to the initial sort of flush of irresponsibility when people were partying, they were burning fires to grill their food and just leaving the ashes when you're not allowed to have any bonfires at all or anything like that on Port Meadow. So but when I go there, I always go there very early in the morning because I don't like meeting too many people when I'm contemplating myself. So I go there sort of at first light, and you can still see a significant a diversity of creatures. I've seen a kingfisher, I've seen some herons, I've seen other sort of birds that are relatively rare, and other plants and so on that are rare too in those encounters. So they're still there to see. And of course there's the wild geese as well, which are sort of flocking there and still multiplying in good numbers. So and the wild ponies and cattle, they're not wild, but they are allowed to free graze there. So as I said, I haven't noticed or seen nearly as much debris there recently as it was at the beginning of lockdown about a year ago in March, April 2020. So that's maybe a positive sign. But people are, as I said, they're always tempted to do wrong, and that it has to be either legally enforced, and eventually, if that happens, then there's a greater willingness then to I think to act differently.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. Near where I live here in Jerusalem, there's a park where I go, and occasionally I see quail, and there's also migrating birds in the fall and the spring. So I went out yesterday right after a rainstorm, and it was very cold, and the nature was just very different than it usually looks. So that was very refreshing for me. I just want to ask you one last question. We met about 5 years ago at a conference in northern Spain on Laudato Si in a place called Torre Ciudad, which at the end of the conference, there was a declaration that was published, and we traveled to Madrid for a press conference with Spanish journalists on Laudato Si. I was very impressed by the organizers of that conference. Partly because at the press conference there were maybe 20 or 30 journalists who were publishing articles and news stories about this conference in Laudato Si. And I look at I read the news, and I don't often read news on religion and ecology as much as I'd like to, and as much as I try to generate news myself. In part by publishing this book called Eco-Bible, which is an ecological commentary on Genesis and Exodus. And it seems like that religion and ecology remains sort of a niche area, that many religious adherents think that religion is one thing and ecology is another thing, and never do the two meet. So if you could just share, one idea for how can we amplify the acceptance and the interest in this very powerful connection between age-old religious teachings and how we live in balance with God's creation.
Yes, I mean, I think you put your finger on an important point, and I mean, I like to go back to the ancient sources. So certainly the biblical texts that speak of the wonder of creation, of the worth of creatures, and those kinds of things. So, I also think that it's also that idea of love, God's love for creation is common across many different religious traditions, and so that can't, I think if people, one of the tendencies certainly in Christian theology and in Catholic theology has been a focus on history to the exclusion of creation. So I think that if there was a greater awareness of the importance of creation in the overall arc of narrative, then I think there would be a much more greater sensitivity to why these things are still significant today. Plus, of course, that's one aspect, but there's also the justice issue. So if you understand, many, certainly very traditional Catholics are usually sensitive to injustices, especially amongst the poorest of the world. So if those stories are shared more widely, and we are trying to do that with bringing in Indigenous communities and others, then people begin to wake up to the fact that these two things are very closely interconnected. So there's the one angle, which is, recognize creation as being significant. And then there's the other angle of our interlaced development questions and issues of development and issues of economics and so on are interwoven and interbound with our ecology in a way that cannot be denied anymore. And therefore, if we don't care for the earth, then we're effectively committing an injustice, not just to the other animals, but also to human beings who are the most vulnerable. So I think it's a two-pronged approach. So, people may or may not be convinced by the idea of intrinsic value or intrinsic worth or the earth as a gift, but they usually are convinced by the importance of caring for the most vulnerable. And I think that if it's framed like that, then hopefully both of those communities, it becomes then an inclusive. So one of the aspects which I think is important to realize too, though, is that an intellectual argument isn't always going to win the day. So people can know in their heads that this is the right thing to do, but whether they do it or not is another question. And that's why I've spent some time myself as a researcher thinking about virtue and ecological virtues and what it is that might encourage people to change their habits of mind, which I think are very closely ingrained. And for that, I think that it's both using our mind or our reason and our affect, so it's a combination of compassion and justice and wisdom that we need together to work through these very challenging times. So it's that really that, I think there are so many different angles we could approach this at. I think it has to come through the heart as well as through the head, rather like, many other scholars have said. Persuasion isn't necessarily going to be enough. Encounters are very important, encounters with the wonder of the natural world that's left. It is also possible to see ecological restoration happening as we speak. So, you can see the impact of changes of practices, even just the microcosm of Port Meadow, where I live. Changing practices in that area has given significant increase in the well-being of those going into those places. They're not surrounded by all these piles of rubbish anymore. So and animals, of course, are not dying in the way they were. Well, I think there was only one example of a death of a cow there, but even that one death is too much. So I think I would say that it's all these factors together. We need to work as a team and not expect any one particular approach. Even my own multi-species approach, it's not going to be sufficient. We have to sort of work at all the different angles and levels, and see what then emerges as a result.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing that. And this has really, for me, been an enlightening hour conversation. And I really appreciate your dedication and your insights and your leadership in helping to ensure that our children and grandchildren, as well as the next generation of all species, inherits a thriving and livable and spiritually aware planet. So may God bless you in your holy efforts. And thank you everyone for joining us. This is Yonatan Neril from the Interfaith Center for Sustainable Development, and I thank you, Dr. Deane-Drummond, for sharing with us today.
Thank you so much for hosting and interesting questions from those who are participating. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to address them all, but thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Great.